My son was shaking when he grabbed my arm. Not crying, not panicked, just shaking. He was 8 years old and had never been afraid of anything in his life. We were standing in the driveway, my car already running, when he looked straight at me and whispered, "Dad, don't go home tonight." It was 9:17 p.m. 10 minutes later, I understood exactly what he was trying to save me from. I turned the engine off and listened to my son breathe. Short and uneven, his fingers still locked around my sleeve, like he might lose me if he let go. The porch light flickered behind us. I asked him why, softly, so I wouldn't scare him, but he just shook his head and stared at the dark house. He said he heard something earlier, something that didn't belong to us. At 9:19 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from my wife asking why I hadn't come inside yet. I felt a chill crawl up my back without warning tonight. I knelt beside him, eye level, telling myself, kids imagine things, that fear borrows adult shapes when silence grows loud. Still, I stayed put. The house windows were black, no television glow, no movement. My wife had texted again, sharper this time. I didn't answer. I asked my son what he heard, and he whispered about footsteps above his room, slow, careful, like someone counting boards. He said he saw our bedroom door open when nobody was home earlier. That detail sat heavy in my chest and refused to settle, even as I tried smiling for him there in silence. I told him we'd go for ice cream, anywhere but inside, a small lie meant to protect us both. He nodded too quickly. As we drove, I called my wife, straight to voicemail. The clock on the dashboard read 9:27 p.m. I told myself she was upset. Nothing more. Yet my hands kept slipping on the wheel. Halfway down the block, my son asked if Grandpa knew the man who used our spare key. I asked, "What man?" He went quiet and stared ahead, like he was replaying something he wished away and didn't want to name out loud now. We parked under bright lights and ordered nothing. I kept watching the door. My phone finally rang. My wife's voice sounded wrong, distant, like she was speaking from a hallway. She asked where we were and told me not to come back yet. I asked why. She said she'd explain later. In the background, I heard a sound I recognized from years ago. Metal scraping wood. The call dropped. My son pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered, "He's inside." Every instinct in me said this was not imagination, and we were already late understanding it tonight alone together. I drove without a destination, circling streets I knew by heart, waiting for my wife to call again. My son finally spoke, asking if I remembered the man from the park who watched houses. I said no. He said the man smiled too long and knew our names. My chest tightened. At 9:41 p.m., a neighbor texted asking if we were okay, saying someone was in our yard earlier. I didn't answer. I realized then, my son hadn't imagined anything at all, and that knowledge changed how every sound felt afterward, pressing heavier with each passing minute without relief anywhere. I pulled into a gas station and told my son to stay in the car while I checked messages. There was one voicemail now. Not from my wife. It was from an unknown number. A man said my door had been forced and asked if I owned a handgun. My mouth went dry. I thanked him and hung up. When I looked back, my son was watching the store entrance, tense and alert. He asked if we could sleep somewhere else. I said yes, already knowing home wasn't safe for either of us. After hearing that message so suddenly now, we checked into a motel near the highway. I locked the door twice and pushed a chair under the handle. My son sat on the bed, shoes still on. Eyes open, I called my wife again. She answered this time and told me to stay where I was. She said someone had been waiting inside, asking about me. About schedules. I asked who. She said she didn't know, but he knew my name. The call ended with her telling me not to trust anyone tonight, especially people who claimed to help suddenly without proof or reason at all anymore. I sat awake listening to cars pass, replaying my son's words until they lost meaning and gained weight. I wondered who had watched us, and why tonight mattered. My phone vibrated once more with a photo from the neighbor. It showed our front door splintered, open to darkness. No police were visible. My son stirred and asked if morning was close. I told him soon. Inside, I felt the truth stretching toward us, unfinished and dangerous, like a rope pulled tight, but not yet snapped, waiting for the moment we'd have to face it without hiding anywhere. Before sleep took him, my son whispered that the man promised he'd see me soon. I asked when. He shook his head and said it would be when I felt safe again. I didn't sleep. I sat by the door, phone in hand, realizing my life had split at 9:17 p.m. Whatever had entered our home wanted me, not him. And as the night deepened, I understood this wasn't a warning that had passed. It was one that had only just begun, with consequences I couldn't yet measure or escape. Despite trying to protect my child from it all alone, I knew morning would bring questions I couldn't answer and dangers I couldn't predict. Somewhere, someone believed patience would deliver me back to that house. I watched the hallway light through the peephole, counting breaths, not minutes. My phone stayed silent, which felt worse than ringing. I decided then I wouldn't return blindly. Whatever waited had already crossed lines. As dawn threatened the edge of the night, I made a choice that would pull others into this, and I feared what that choice might cost us all together sooner than expected, without mercy or warning at all, for anyone involved. The sky was just beginning to thin when my phone vibrated again. Not a ring, just a single sharp buzz that felt louder than it should have in the quiet motel room. I checked the time without really meaning to, then stopped myself remembering how easily numbers had started to anchor fear. The message was from my wife. She said she was safe but not home. She said she'd left before the man realized she wasn't alone. She told me not to call her back yet. That last part sat wrong with me, heavier than everything else she'd written. My son was still asleep, curled tight, one hand tucked under his chin like he did when he was very young. I sat on the edge of the bed and read the message again, looking for something hidden between the lines. Safe but not home. Left before he realized. I wondered how long he had been there before she noticed him, how long he had been watching us before any of this began. The idea that someone knew our routines well enough to wait inside our house made my stomach tighten in a way that didn't fade. I stepped into the bathroom and locked the door behind me, not because I needed privacy, but because I needed something solid between me and the world. I called the number that had left the voicemail earlier. It rang once before a man answered, breathless, like he'd been expecting the call. He said he lived 2 houses down. He said he'd seen a stranger force our door then disappear inside. He said he didn't call the police because the man told him he had permission, but that detail snapped something inside me. I asked why he left a voicemail asking about a gun. There was a pause. He said, the man asked if I carried one. Said it casually, like small talk. I felt a slow heat rise behind my eyes. I told him to stay away from my house, and hung up before he could say anything else. When I unlocked the bathroom door, my son was sitting up, watching me with the same quiet alertness he'd had all night. He asked if Mom was okay. I said yes, and hated how uncertain my voice sounded. I packed quickly. I didn't know where we were going, only that staying still felt dangerous. Before we left, I checked my phone again. Another message from my wife had come through. She said the man wasn't a stranger. She said she recognized his voice after he spoke longer. She said she hadn't wanted to tell me over the phone, but I needed to be prepared. She said he used to work with me, years ago before I transferred departments. I had to sit down when I read that. On the drive out of the lot, my son asked if we were being followed. I checked the mirrors too many times. Every car felt like a threat. Every slowdown an invitation for something bad to catch up. I told him we were just going to get breakfast. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Kids sense when adults lie to protect them, and it makes them feel smaller, not safer. He stared out the window, jaw set like he was already bracing for something he didn't know how to name. We stopped at a diner I'd been to once before, off a road that didn't lead anywhere important. I chose a booth with my back to the wall. While my son ate, I replayed faces from my old job, trying to match them to the idea of a man waiting in my house, confident enough to talk to neighbors. One name kept surfacing, uninvited, a man who'd been let go after an internal investigation, a man who blamed me for speaking up. I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was coincidence. My phone rang then. This time it was my wife, calling despite her earlier warning. She sounded calmer, but that made me more uneasy, not less. She said she was with her sister. She said the man hadn't followed her. She said he'd been asking about me specifically. About when I'd be alone. I asked what he wanted. She said he never said, he just smiled, and told her to tell me he was sorry for how things ended. That was when I stopped pretending this was random. I told her to stay where she was, and not to contact anyone from my work. She hesitated, then agreed. After the call ended, my son asked why Mom sounded scared. I told him sometimes adults are scared too, even when they don't want to be. He nodded like that made sense. He asked if the man was angry at me. I didn't answer right away. Then I said yes. But anger doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it waits quietly until it thinks you've forgotten. We left the diner without finishing our food. I drove toward a friend's place, someone I trusted, someone outside the orbit of my job and our family routines. Halfway there, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. It said, "You raised a smart boy. He listens when danger speaks." My hands tightened on the wheel until my knuckles ached. I didn't show my son the message. I didn't need to. He already knew enough. I pulled over and turned the engine off. My son looked at me, eyes wide but steady. I told him we were changing plans. I told him we were going somewhere safer. He asked if the man knew where we were going. I said no, but I wasn't sure that was true. The text had told me something else. Something colder. This wasn't just about me anymore. He had watched my son closely enough to know his instincts mattered. That realization felt like a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Before I could start the car again, my phone rang once more. It was my old supervisor. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He said he'd heard there was trouble. He said he wanted to help. I didn't ask how he knew. I just listened to his voice, measuring every word. When he mentioned the name I'd been trying not to think about, my chest tightened. He told me the man had been asking questions again. He told me this wasn't over. Not yet. I ended the call without agreeing to anything. I sat there with the engine silent, my son watching me, the weight of everything pressing down at once. Whoever had waited in my house wasn't finished. He had reached out to neighbors, to my family, to my past, and now others were circling too, offering help that felt conditional. I started the car and drove, knowing the next decision I made would pull us deeper into something dangerous, something that wouldn't let go easily, and that safety was no longer a place, but a moving target we had to keep chasing. I didn't go to my friend's place. Halfway there, something in me resisted the idea of bringing danger to someone else's door. I turned onto a side road instead, one I barely remembered, lined with old warehouses and shuttered storefronts. I needed space to think, not comfort. My son didn't ask questions. He sat quietly, hands folded, like he understood that silence was safer than curiosity right now. That scared me more than anything else, the way he had adapted so quickly. I parked behind a closed auto shop and shut the engine off again. I checked my phone. No new messages. That absence felt deliberate. I thought about my old supervisor's call, how easily he'd slipped back into authority, how naturally he'd assumed I'd cooperate. I remembered the investigation, the statements I'd signed, the way one man's career had ended while mine quietly continued. I had told myself back then that consequences were necessary. Sitting there now, I wondered how long consequences could travel before finding you again. My son finally spoke, asking if the man was coming back to our house. I told him we weren't going back there. He nodded, then asked if the man knew his school. The question landed hard. I told him no, but my certainty was thin. I realized I'd been thinking like someone protecting himself, not like a parent protecting a child. Whoever this was had already crossed into our private world without hesitation. That meant I had to assume he'd gathered more than I wanted to believe. I called my wife and told her where we were. She told me not to stay still. She said her sister had noticed a car idling down the block earlier, a man inside pretending to be on the phone. She said it might be nothing, but her voice betrayed her. I told her to keep the doors locked and to pack essentials. She asked where we'd meet. I didn't have an answer yet. That silence stretched between us, full of fear neither of us wanted to name. After the call, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time there was no message, just a missed call. I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. My son watched my face closely, reading it like a map. He asked if the man was mad because I told the truth about him. I froze. I asked how he knew that. He shrugged and said he heard Mom talking once, late at night, about work and lies. He said the man had mentioned it too, said I was honest to a fault. The detail shifted something inside me. This wasn't just revenge, it was personal, in a way that had been growing quietly, fed by time and resentment. I thought about the way the man had asked, about my schedule, about when I'd be alone. He wasn't rushing. He was arranging. I realized then that running blindly would only exhaust us. I needed information, clarity, leverage. I needed to know how far this went, and who else was involved. I made another call, one I'd hoped never to make again, a former colleague, someone who'd kept his head down during the investigation and stayed friendly with everyone afterward. He answered cautiously. I told him I needed to know if anyone had been asking about me. There was a pause, then a sigh. He said yes. He said the man had been asking questions for weeks, framing them as concern. He said others thought it was strange but harmless. I thanked him and hung up, my jaw tight. Weeks, that meant this had been unfolding while I was eating dinner with my family, helping with homework, falling asleep on the couch. The idea that danger had been that close, that patient, made my skin crawl. I looked at my son and felt a surge of guilt so sharp it almost stole my breath. He had sensed something long before I had. He had listened when I hadn't. I promised myself silently that I wouldn't ignore that again. I decided to move. Not randomly, but deliberately. I drove toward a small motel on the edge of town, one with outdoor entrances and a clear view of the lot. I chose a room on the second floor. I checked every corner before letting my son inside. He sat on the bed and watched me work, his expression serious. I told him to keep his shoes on. I told him to stay quiet. He nodded, understanding too well for his age. Once we were settled, I called my old supervisor back. I told him I wanted to talk, but not on the phone. I told him I needed answers, not reassurance. He suggested a place, neutral ground. I agreed, then immediately regretted it. I didn't tell him where we were staying. I didn't tell my wife either. I realized secrecy had become a tool I hated, but needed. Trust felt like a liability now. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my wife sending a photo. It showed a note, tucked under her sister's door. No name, just a sentence written carefully. You can't hide forever. I felt my pulse spike. I told her to call the police. She said she already had. They told her there wasn't much they could do without a direct threat. That answer made something cold settle in my chest. We were being warned, not attacked. Not yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. My son leaned against me, his head resting on my arm. He whispered that the man would try to make me choose wrong. I asked what he meant. He said, "The man talked about choices like games. Said adults always pick what's easiest, not what's right." I closed my eyes. I knew then that whatever meeting I'd agreed to wasn't about answers. It was about pressure. I checked the window and scanned the lot again. A car pulled in and parked 2 rows away. The driver stayed inside. My heart began to pound. I told my son to stay low. I watched the car, every muscle tense. After a long moment, it drove off. I didn't relax. I couldn't. The sense of being watched had settled in and refused to leave. As night pressed in again, I realized the next step would force a confrontation. I couldn't avoid. I had information now, but not control. Someone was testing how far they could push without consequences. I knew if I misjudged this, it wouldn't just be me paying the price. I looked down at my son, at the trust in his eyes, and understood that whatever came next would demand more than fear or caution. It would demand a decision that could change all of our lives, and I wasn't sure yet which cost would be worse. I didn't sleep. I lay on the narrow motel bed with my arm draped protectively over my son, listening to the muted sounds of traffic and footsteps outside our door. Every laugh, every slammed car door sent a jolt through me. My phone stayed face up on the nightstand, dark and silent, which felt intentional, like the quiet before someone decided to knock. I kept replaying my son's words about choices, about adults choosing what's easiest. I knew exactly what the easy choice would be tomorrow, and I hated how tempting it already felt. When my son finally drifted into a shallow sleep, I slipped out of bed and stood by the window again. The parking lot lights cast harsh shadows that made every parked car look occupied. I wondered how much the man knew about me now, how much he thought he could predict. He had waited inside my home without fear. That meant he believed I wouldn't hurt him. Not really. He believed rules still mattered to me. That belief felt like both an insult and a weapon aimed straight at my family. My phone buzzed once, making my heart jump, a message from my old supervisor. He said the place was confirmed. He said it would be quiet. He said I didn't need to involve anyone else. The phrasing bothered me. It sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced saying to calm people down. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my notes app and wrote down everything I knew, every name, every strange interaction from the past few weeks. If something happened to me, I wanted a record that couldn't be erased by silence. As I wrote, patterns began to emerge. Small things I'd brushed off before suddenly lined up. The random question at work about my commute. The casual comment from a former colleague about my son being sharp. The way my wife had mentioned feeling watched while I was away on a short trip weeks earlier. None of it had seemed urgent alone. Together it painted a picture I didn't like. This wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, designed to tighten slowly. I stopped writing when I heard a soft knock. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to announce presence. My body went rigid. I glanced at the clock instinctively, then forced myself to look away. Numbers didn't matter anymore. I moved quietly to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I waited, counting breaths instead of seconds. Another knock came, slightly firmer. My son stirred behind me, mumbling my name. I whispered for him to stay still. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I stood there until the knock stopped. After a long stretch of silence, footsteps retreated. I stayed frozen, listening until they faded completely. When I finally turned around, my son was sitting up, eyes wide. He asked who it was. I told him it was no one. He didn't argue. He just nodded, like he'd already decided the truth for himself. That look on his face made something inside me harden. I called my wife and told her about the knock. She went quiet, then said her sister's neighbor had seen someone walking the block again, slow and deliberate. She asked if we should meet somewhere public. I said not yet. I told her to stay put and to keep her phone on. She didn't like it, but she agreed. When the call ended, I felt the weight of isolation settle in. This was what he wanted. Separate us, make each decision feel like a gamble. I thought about canceling the meeting, about disappearing for a while. But I knew that would only delay things. The note under my sister-in-law's door had been clear. Hiding would be interpreted as weakness, not caution, and weakness invited escalation. I needed to shift the balance even if just slightly. That meant facing him, but on terms he didn't fully control. The question was how. I made another call. This one to someone outside my usual circles. An old family friend who worked in private security now, someone who understood quiet problems and discretion. I didn't give details. I didn't have to. He heard it in my voice. He told me what to do, what not to do. He told me to assume I was already being watched, and to behave accordingly. When the call ended, I felt a small measure of control return. Fragile, but real. I packed our things again, moving carefully, keeping my son close. Before we left, I checked the hallway once more. Empty. We walked down the stairs and crossed the lot without incident. I drove toward the meeting place, but took a longer route, doubling back once, just to be sure no one followed. That didn't reassure me. It made me suspicious. Whoever was orchestrating this knew patience better than panic. The place was a quiet cafe near an office park. Half empty, the kind of spot people use for conversations they didn't want overheard, but didn't want to hide either. I told my son to stay in the car with a book and locked the doors. He grabbed my sleeve before I closed it and asked me not to trust anyone who smiled too quickly. I promised him I wouldn't. I didn't tell him how hard that promise would be to keep inside. My old supervisor was already seated, nursing a coffee. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were sharp. He smiled when he saw me, the same practiced smile I remembered. He gestured for me to sit. I didn't. I asked where the other man was. The smile faltered, just a fraction. He said he couldn't make it, but he wanted to talk on his behalf. That was when I knew this meeting wasn't about helping me at all. He spoke calmly, carefully, laying out concerns, regrets, misunderstandings. He suggested ways this could all end quietly. All it would take was my cooperation, my willingness to revisit old statements, to soften certain truths. As he talked, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. This was the choice my son had warned me about. Easy versus right, safety versus integrity. The price of saying no was still unknown, but the cost of saying yes was suddenly very clear. I stood up without answering. I told him I needed time. His expression tightened, the friendliness dropping away. He warned me that time wasn't something I had much of. I didn't respond. I walked out and went back to my car, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been all night. My son looked up at me, searching my face. I told him we were leaving again. He nodded, relief flickering briefly before concern returned. As we drove away, my phone buzzed. A new message from the unknown number. You chose the hard way. I didn't show it to my son. I didn't need to. I felt it settle into my bones. Whatever restraint had existed before was gone now. I had refused the easy path, and with that refusal, I knew the danger would change shape. The question wasn't if things would get worse. It was how quickly, and how far the man was willing to go to force my hand next. The moment I read the message, I deleted it. Not because I wanted to forget it, but because I didn't want it sitting on my phone like a trigger waiting to be pulled. My son watched the road ahead, silent, his knees pulled up slightly, as if making himself smaller might make us harder to find. I drove without turning on the radio, without speaking, letting the hum of the engine fill the space where fear might otherwise grow too loud. I knew then that this wasn't a standoff anymore. It was a chase that hadn't revealed its full speed yet. I took us to a place I hadn't planned to use unless things went truly sideways. A small rental house owned by the same family friend I'd called earlier, empty most of the year, tucked behind a cluster of trees. It wasn't hidden, just overlooked. The kind of place people passed every day without noticing. I parked behind the house and kept the lights off. My son followed me inside, eyes scanning, learning habits no child should have to learn. I locked every door and checked the windows twice. Inside, the quiet felt different. Not the tense quiet of the motel, but a waiting quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath with us. I sat my son down and explained rules in a calm voice. No opening doors, no answering unfamiliar calls, no telling anyone where we were. He listened carefully, nodding at each point. When I finished, he asked a question that cut through everything. He asked if this was his fault. I dropped to my knees in front of him and told him no, with a firmness I'd never used before. I told him he'd done the bravest thing possible by speaking up. I told him he might have saved us both. He absorbed that slowly, like he wasn't used to praise tied to danger. He asked if the man would stop. Now that I'd said no, I didn't lie. I told him I didn't know. I told him some people don't stop. When they're challenged, they escalate. He accepted that answer with a maturity that made my chest ache. Then he asked if Mom was safe. I said she was, even though safety felt temporary for all of us now. I checked my phone again. No new messages. That worried me more than if there had been. Silence meant recalibration. I called my wife and told her where we were, in vague terms. I told her not to try to join us yet. She protested, her voice tight. But I insisted. I could hear something else in her breathing. Something like anger, not just fear. She said the police had come by her sister's place again. They asked questions. They took notes. They left. No promises. No protection. After the call, I sat at the small kitchen table and thought about the investigation years ago, about how much I'd assumed it was over. I'd believed that once the truth was documented, once the system had moved on, so had everyone involved. I saw now how naive that had been. For some people, losing isn't an end. It's a wound that festers until it finds a way to reopen. The man hadn't just lost his job. He'd lost his narrative. The story he told himself about who was to blame. My phone buzzed again. A number I recognized this time. Another former colleague. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He said there were rumors spreading. He said people were being asked to pick sides. He said my name was coming up in conversations it shouldn't. I asked who was asking. He didn't say. He just warned me to be careful. When the call ended, I realized this had expanded beyond one man. Others were being drawn in, whether they wanted to be or not. I walked to the window and peered through the trees. Nothing moved. No cars slowed. Still, I felt exposed. I told my son to go into the back room and play quietly. He did, but he left the door open, wanting to stay connected. I understood that need. I needed it too. I sat down again and made another list. This one of leverage. Who knew what? Who owed me favors? Who might speak if pushed? It wasn't a comfortable exercise, but comfort had left us behind. A knock came at the door. Sharp and confident. Not hesitant like before. My heart slammed against my ribs. I signaled for my son to stay where he was. I moved toward the door slowly, checking the window beside it first. A uniform stood on the other side. Police. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by suspicion. I opened the door just enough to speak. The officer said there had been a report of a suspicious vehicle nearby. He asked if everything was okay. I answered carefully. I told him yes. For now, he asked if anyone else was with me. I said my son. He nodded and asked to speak to him. I hesitated, then agreed, watching closely as my son came forward. The officer crouched to his level and asked simple questions. My son answered honestly, but minimally. When it was over, the officer stood and said to call if anything changed. He left without looking back. I locked the door and leaned against it, my legs shaking. As soon as the officer's car disappeared, My phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. Good, you involved them. That makes this more interesting. My stomach dropped. That meant he'd known about the police before I did, or worse, he'd anticipated it. I realized then that this wasn't just about pressure anymore. It was about control, about watching reactions and adjusting accordingly. I felt like a piece on a board I hadn't agreed to play on. I went to my son and knelt in front of him again. I told him things might get louder. Before they got quiet, I told him we'd face it together. He nodded, trusting me in a way that felt almost unbearable. Outside, the trees swayed gently, indifferent to our fear. I understood then that the next move wouldn't come with a warning knock or a message meant to scare. It would come disguised as something helpful, something reasonable, and if I wasn't careful, it would catch us unprepared. As night settled again, I knew we were approaching a turning point. I had refused to bend, and that had changed the rules. Whatever happened next would test more than my resolve. It would test how much risk I was willing to absorb to keep my family intact. And as I sat there listening to my son breathe in the next room, I understood with chilling clarity that the man watching us wasn't done proving how far he could reach, and how many lines he was willing to cross to make me understand that. I stopped reacting to every sound. That was the first real change. Fear had sharpened into something colder, something more deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, watching the outline of the trees through the window, listening for patterns instead of noise. My son slept in the back room. His door cracked just enough for me to hear him breathe. I kept my phone face down now. If it buzzed, I would choose when to look, not the other way around. The message about the police hadn't just been a threat, it had been a confirmation. Whoever this was, he had eyes where I didn't. That meant I needed to assume everything visible to me was also visible to him. Cars, calls, help. Even fear. I forced myself to slow down, to think the way he expected me not to. Panic was predictable. Patience wasn't. I decided then that I would stop giving him reactions for free. My wife called quietly, whispering even though she was alone. She said someone from my old workplace had shown up at her sister's door earlier, claiming concern, asking questions under the excuse of checking in. She hadn't answered. Just this would end. If I gave them what they wanted, I told her no. I told her it would only change shape. She went quiet, then said she believed me. That belief felt heavier than fear, because now I carried responsibility for both of them fully. After the call, I made another one, this time to the family friend who owned the house. I told him I thought we'd been compromised. He didn't sound surprised. He said the man I was dealing with had a reputation for patience and leverage, not violence. He said that made him more dangerous, not less. Violence ended things. Leverage kept them alive. I asked what I should expect next. He said an offer, something that sounded reasonable, even fair, but would cost me more than I realized. The offer came sooner than I expected. My phone buzzed once, then stopped. I waited. When I finally turned it over, there was an email, not a text. No sender name, just an address that meant nothing. The message was polite, almost apologetic. It said there had been misunderstandings, that emotions had run high, that no one wanted to hurt my family. It said there was a way to settle things quietly. All they needed was a meeting, just me, no supervisors, no police, neutral ground. Closure. I felt my jaw tighten. This was the mask. Calm, reasonable, designed to make refusal look irrational. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to a secure folder and turned the phone off completely. That choice felt like jumping off a ledge without knowing how far the drop was, but it was necessary. I needed silence on my terms. I needed to observe without being observed, at least briefly. I checked on my son. He stirred when I sat beside him and asked if we were okay. I said we were managing. He asked if the man would try to talk to me again. I said yes. He thought about that, then asked if talking always meant losing. The question startled me. I told him talking didn't mean agreeing. Sometimes it meant listening until you understood what not to do. He nodded, satisfied with that answer, and rolled over, trusting me to handle the rest. I didn't sleep. I planned. Not in grand moves, but in small protections. I rearranged our positions in the house. I checked sightlines. I prepared exits. I hoped not to use. I wrote another note in my phone. This one addressed to my son, explaining choices in simple terms. Just in case. Writing it felt like tempting fate, but not writing it felt worse. I saved it and locked it away, telling myself it was precaution, not surrender. When I turned my phone back on, there were missed calls. My supervisor again. A blocked number. My wife. I called her first. She said she'd received a similar email, framed as concern for her well-being, that confirmed it. This wasn't just pressure on me anymore. It was pressure on us, designed to fracture our unity, to see who might bend first. I told her not to respond. I told her to forward everything to me. She agreed, her voice steadier than before. Then I called my supervisor back. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I told him calmly that any further contact would be documented and shared. He tried to laugh it off, said I was overreacting. I let the silence stretch until he filled it with excuses. When I ended the call, my hands were steady. I realized then that fear had started to migrate. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't owning me anymore. That shift mattered. Another message arrived. Shorter this time, less polite. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I deleted it without reading it twice. I understood the escalation. Reason had failed. Now frustration was surfacing. That meant mistakes were more likely. People who rely on control don't handle resistance well. When it doesn't look like panic, they miscalculate. They reveal things. I decided to wait for that. I contacted one more person, someone who had quietly opposed the investigation's outcome years ago, but had never spoken publicly. I asked him what he knew now. He hesitated, then said he'd been approached recently, asked to testify differently if things were ever reopened. That was the confirmation I needed. This wasn't about closure. It was about rewriting history, about erasing accountability, and my refusal was blocking more than one agenda. I felt anger rise then, sharp and focused, not the reckless kind, the kind that clarifies. I looked at my son, still asleep, unaware of the layers of conflict pressing in around him, and I made a decision. I wouldn't disappear. I wouldn't negotiate in the dark. If they wanted to reopen the past, I would control how it opened, and who was watching when it did. Outside, a car slowed on the road, then continued. I didn't move. I didn't react. I let it pass. I understood now that the danger wasn't immediate harm. It was erosion of truth, of resolve, of unity, and I was done letting that erosion happen quietly. The next move would come soon, dressed up as opportunity or apology, and when it did, I would be ready to turn it against the people who thought patience made them untouchable. The next move didn't come from the man directly. That was how I knew it mattered. It arrived through someone I hadn't heard from in years, a name that pulled me backward before I even opened the message. A former legal consultant from the investigation, someone who'd once prided himself on staying neutral. He said he needed to talk. He said things were shifting, and it would be better if I heard it from him than through rumors. I didn't trust the concern in his tone, but I trusted the timing even less. I didn't respond right away. I watched my son eat cereal at the small table, carefully pouring the milk so it didn't spill. Normal motions in an abnormal world. He asked if we'd be able to go back to school soon. I told him we'd figure it out. He didn't push. That restraint felt learned, not natural, and it tightened something in my chest. I realized then that whatever happened next needed to shorten this, not stretch it further. Prolonged danger was its own kind of harm. I called the consultant back after my son went into the other room. I put the call on speaker but kept my voice neutral. He didn't waste time. He said there were efforts underway to reopen old files, to correct procedural mistakes. He said my name had come up as an obstacle, someone unwilling to cooperate. He framed it as advice, said I still had a chance to influence how this played out. I asked who was pushing it. He avoided the question. That told me enough. I told him I would cooperate fully with any legitimate review, with everything documented and above board. I told him I would not meet privately, not retract statements, not soften facts. There was a pause, longer this time. He said that would complicate things. I said the truth often did. When the call ended, I felt a shift again. Subtle, but real. They weren't just testing me anymore. They were mapping resistance. My phone buzzed moments later. A message from my wife. She said she'd been followed while driving earlier just for a short stretch, long enough to notice. She hadn't panicked. She'd taken turns she didn't need to take. The car eventually disappeared. She asked what this meant. I told her it meant pressure was increasing, because leverage was failing. I told her to stay with her sister for now, to vary routines, to trust her instincts. She said she was tired of being afraid. I understood that too well. I stepped outside briefly, scanning the road, the tree line, anything out of place. Nothing stood out. That was the problem. Whoever was doing this didn't need to be obvious. They wanted us to feel seen without seeing them. I went back inside and locked the door. I realized then that waiting passively was no longer an option. If I stayed reactive, I'd always be one step behind. I needed to force daylight onto this, not hide from it. I made a call to an internal oversight body I'd avoided contacting before. Not law enforcement, not media, an office that dealt with procedural integrity. I didn't accuse, I requested guidance. I asked about protections for witnesses facing intimidation. The woman on the line listened carefully, asked measured questions, and told me what documentation mattered. She told me to keep records. She told me not to isolate. When the call ended, I felt something unfamiliar, support that didn't come with conditions. The reaction was almost immediate. An hour later, my phone rang from a blocked number. I didn't answer. A voicemail followed, the man's voice this time. Calm, disappointed. He said he'd hoped I was smarter than this. He said involving outsiders complicated things unnecessarily. He said I was putting my family in a difficult position. The words were chosen carefully, but the threat underneath them was clear. I deleted the message without replaying it. I didn't need to hear it twice. My son came into the room and asked if the house we were in belonged to someone nice. I smiled despite everything, and said yes. He asked if that meant the man wouldn't come here. I hesitated, then said it meant we weren't alone. That answer seemed to comfort him. He sat beside me and leaned against my arm, quiet but present. That small weight grounded me more than any plan. Another message arrived, this time from my supervisor again. Urgent now. He said we needed to talk before things went too far. I didn't respond. I forwarded it to the oversight contact, along with everything else. That act felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but it also felt right. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was documenting. I was anchoring truth in places harder to reach. As evening settled, a new tension filled the house. Not panic. Anticipation. I knew they would try one more angle before changing tactics completely. People like this didn't back down quietly. They escalated until exposed or victorious. I prepared my son for another move. Without details, just reassurance. I told him if anyone came to the door, he was to stay where he was and call out for me. He agreed. Solemn. The knock came later, louder than before. Authoritative. Not police, not tentative. I didn't open the door. I asked who it was. A familiar voice answered. My supervisor's, asking to talk face to face. He said this didn't need to get ugly. I told him to leave. He insisted. I told him again, louder. After a moment, footsteps retreated. I waited until the sound was gone before moving. I checked my phone. A final message for the night had come through. You've chosen exposure. Be careful what comes with it. I didn't delete this one. I saved it. Evidence now mattered more than fear. I looked at my son, at the way he watched me. Learning how adults faced pressure, I realized this wasn't just about protecting him from danger anymore. It was about showing him how to stand when danger tried to bend you. As darkness deepened, I knew the next phase would break something open. Either their confidence or the illusion of safety we'd been clinging to. There would be fallout. There always was when truth stopped being negotiable. I sat with that knowledge, steady, understanding that whatever happened next would push this story into a place where hiding was no longer possible for anyone involved. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating against the table. Not ringing, just pulsing insistently, like it knew better than to draw attention to itself. For a moment, I didn't move. I lay there listening to my son's breathing from the other room, steady and unaware, and I understood that whatever waited on the other end of that vibration would try to pull me away from that calm. I let it buzz until it stopped. When I finally checked, there were 3 missed calls and 1 message marked urgent. The message wasn't from the man or my supervisor. It was from the oversight office. The tone was formal but clipped. They wanted to speak immediately. They had received my documentation and had concerns about witness interference and coordinated pressure. Reading those words sent a strange mix of relief and dread through me. Relief because someone else finally saw what I saw. Dread because this meant the quiet phase was officially over. I stepped into the kitchen and closed the door softly before calling them back. The woman I spoke to didn't waste time. She told me my situation had escalated beyond advisory. She said there were patterns consistent with obstruction. She asked if I felt safe. I hesitated, then said no, not entirely. She told me to listen carefully. She said not to meet anyone privately, not to respond to further contact, and not to leave my current location unless necessary. She said arrangements were being discussed at a higher level. That last sentence hung in the air after the call ended. I stood there staring at the wall, absorbing what that meant. Higher level meant visibility. It meant the man who thought patience made him untouchable had underestimated how many people he'd pulled into his orbit. It also meant he would know soon that control was slipping. That was the most dangerous moment. People who thrive on leverage don't surrender it quietly. They try one last push, one last narrative shift, before the ground gives way beneath them. My son wandered in, rubbing his eyes, and asked if it was morning yet. I told him yes, and poured him a glass of juice. He sensed the change immediately, the tension tightening instead of diffusing. He asked if something bad was going to happen. I knelt down and told him something important was happening. Not bad, but serious. He accepted that distinction more easily than I expected. He asked if Mom knew. I said she would soon. As if summoned, my wife called. Moments later, her voice was shaking. Not with fear this time, but with anger. She said my supervisor had called her directly, apologizing for misunderstandings, offering protection if we cooperated. She said he'd implied things could get messy if we didn't. She asked if I'd told anyone else. I told her yes. I told her everything. There was a long pause. Then she exhaled sharply and said she was proud of me. That single sentence steadied me more than anything else had. The first real crack came shortly after. A message appeared on my phone from a number I didn't recognize, but the name attached made my stomach drop. It was the man. No mask this time. No politeness. He accused me of betrayal, of forcing his hand. He said I'd turned a professional disagreement into a personal crusade. He said he'd wanted to keep families out of it, but I'd made that impossible. I didn't respond. I forwarded it immediately, hands steady, heart pounding. Minutes later, another message arrived. Longer, rambling. He claimed he'd been wronged, that the investigation had ruined him unfairly, that I'd lied to save myself. He said he could prove it. He said people would listen if I didn't stop him. I saw then what this really was. Panic, control slipping, replaced by desperation. The patience that had defined him was cracking, revealing something far less calculated underneath. I took my son into the back room and put on a quiet show for him, something familiar. I sat beside him, pretending to watch, while my phone kept vibrating with incoming messages I refused to open. I wanted him anchored in normalcy, even as everything else shifted. He leaned against me and asked if we were winning. I didn't know how to answer that. I told him we were standing. Sometimes that was enough. Another call came from the oversight office. This time there were two voices on the line. They told me formal steps were being initiated. They told me there might be attempts to discredit me publicly. They asked if I was prepared for that. I thought about my son, my wife. The years of silence I'd assumed were closure. I said yes. I said the truth was already heavier than any rumor. They thanked me and told me to stay reachable. The fallout didn't wait. A former colleague texted me, confused, asking why my name was suddenly being discussed in emails. Another warned me to check my reputation, said stories were circulating. I ignored them all. I knew better than to chase smoke. The man was trying to regain control by flooding the space with noise. It was a classic move, and it was failing. Too many eyes were watching now. Too many records existed. As evening crept in, my wife sent a message saying officials had come to her sister's place, asking formal questions, documenting everything. She said it felt different this time. Serious. I believed her. I felt it too. The pressure in my chest eased slightly, replaced by a heavier responsibility. The exposure was happening, but exposure cut both ways. I had to stay clean, precise, unwavering. One last message came through as the light faded outside. Short, bitter. You think this ends clean? I didn't save it. I didn't forward it. I didn't delete it either. I just let it sit there, unread after the first glance, stripped of power by my refusal to engage. I understood then that the story he'd been telling himself was collapsing. And when people lose their story, they either disappear or lash out. I tucked my son into bed that night and sat beside him until he fell asleep. As I watched his face relax, I felt the weight of everything we'd carried together. I knew the next phase would no longer be quiet or subtle. There would be consequences, names attached, truths dragged into places they'd been hidden from. The danger hadn't vanished. It had transformed, and as I turned off the light and stepped back into the darkened room, I understood with chilling clarity that the final confrontation wouldn't be about proving what happened in the past. It would be about deciding who controlled the truth going forward and how much damage someone was willing to do when they realized they no longer did. The confrontation didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It came quietly, wrapped in procedure, which somehow made it heavier. I was asked to appear in a formal setting, not as an accused man but as a witness whose patience had finally forced the truth into the open. I arranged for my son to stay with someone I trusted, and when he hugged me goodbye, he held on longer than usual. He didn't ask where I was going. He just said he'd listen if I told him not to answer the door for anyone. I told him he was doing exactly the right thing. Inside the building, the air felt still, insulated from emotion. People spoke carefully, choosing words like they were tools. I laid out everything, not dramatically, not defensively, just in sequence. Messages, calls, names, patterns. I watched faces change as the full picture assembled itself. The patience the man had relied on, the belief that time would dull memory and courage, had worked against him. Records had a way of preserving what people hoped would fade. When he was brought in, he didn't look like the figure who had haunted our nights. He looked smaller, tired, eyes darting as if searching for control that had already slipped away. He tried once to meet my gaze. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require eye contact. It stood on its own. As questions pressed in on him, His story fractured. He contradicted himself. He reached for justifications that no longer fit. Watching that unraveling, I felt no triumph, only a dull sadness for how far things had been allowed to go. The process didn't end that day. It spilled outward, methodically. People who had hovered at the edges were called in. Emails were reviewed. Conversations re-examined. Each step peeled back another layer of silence. My supervisor resigned quietly before he was asked to. Others distanced themselves, suddenly unable to remember conversations they'd once defended. The machine that had protected them turned slowly, then decisively, once exposed to enough light. When it was over for the day, I stepped outside and breathed deeply for the first time in what felt like years. My phone buzzed with a message from my wife. She said she'd been told the pressure was lifted, that there would be no more contact, no more misunderstandings. She said she felt like she could finally sleep. I closed my eyes and let that sink in. Safety hadn't returned all at once, but something close to it had begun to take shape. I picked up my son that evening. He asked if the man was gone. I told him the man couldn't hurt us anymore. He nodded, processing that in his own way. Later, as we sat together eating dinner, he asked why adults sometimes do bad things even when they know better. I thought carefully before answering. I told him some people mistake control for strength, and when they lose it, they don't know who they are anymore. He accepted that quietly, then went back to his food. Life didn't snap back to normal. It never does. There were conversations to have, routines to rebuild, trust to relearn. My wife and I talked late into the night about what we'd missed, about how close we'd come to letting fear dictate our choices. There was guilt there, and relief, and a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted between us. We were more cautious now, but also more honest. Silence no longer felt like peace. Sometimes late at night I still replay that moment in the driveway, my son's small hand gripping my arm, his voice steady despite the fear underneath it. I think about how easily I might have brushed him off, how close I came to walking into a danger I didn't see. He noticed because he listened, because he trusted his instincts when adults often don't. That realization stays with me, a reminder of where wisdom sometimes comes from. The man tried once more to reach out, through official channels, claiming misunderstanding, regret, asking for leniency. It didn't work. The system he'd tried to manipulate had turned its attention fully on him now. Consequences arrived, not with drama, but with finality. Careers ended, reputations shifted, the truth settled where it belonged, heavier than any threat he'd made. On a quiet evening, not long after, my son and I stood in the driveway again, this time with the house lit warmly behind us. He asked if we could go back inside. I said yes. As we stepped through the door, nothing waited for us there except the familiar creak of the floor and the quiet comfort of home, reclaimed. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it no longer owned the space. Later, as I tucked him into bed, he asked if listening to him had changed things. I told him it had. That it had changed everything. He smiled at that. A small, satisfied smile, and drifted off to sleep. I sat there for a while longer, watching him, understanding that courage doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sounds like a child, whispering a warning, and an adult finally choosing to listen. I turned off the light and closed the door softly behind me. The night outside was calm, unremarkable, the way nights are meant to be. I knew there would be echoes of this for a long time, moments when the memory tightened unexpectedly. But I also knew something else now. Danger loses its power when it's dragged into the open, and fear weakens when it's met with resolve instead of silence. That understanding stayed with me as I walked back down the hallway, not as a victory but as a lesson paid for dearly, and learned fully. The past couldn't be undone, but the future no longer felt like a trap waiting to close. And for the first time since my son grabbed my arm and told me not to go home, I believed him when he said everything was going to be okay.